Thank you for that warm welcome. Yes, I'm Elizabeth, and I'm together with Alwyn and Christine. We'll be sharing more about this project that is currently in our phase 1. So next slide, basically there'll be 3 of us who'll be sharing. So I will be talking a bit more about the background of the project and the design, and then Christine will be following giving us some of the findings from the survey, and Alwyn will be talking more from the video perspective. Next slide. So LADDER is the acronym for basically a multimodal learning analytics approach towards learner dashboard designs for better engagement and metacognitive regulation. I know it's like a slight mouthful, but basically we're looking at engagement. That's the main focus, and using a multimodal learning approach, and it's looking at the relationship between engagement and metacognitive regulation. So that's the aim. And this project, as what Victor has mentioned, is relatively large scale. You can see from the team, we have local and international academics and even postdocs with us. And next slide. And we also have our MOE colleagues who are also part of the team. And I think 1 or 2 of them are here. So the reason for this project, or some background, is that many times when students go online and they use whichever web-based application, and a lot of them right now are designing dashboards for them to view their progress, to view updates, and so on. So that those are basically learn dashboards, as the definition says. There are basically learning analytics data that are student-facing. So of course, student-centered or student-facing learner dashboards to provide timely, interactive, and visual feedback to support learning. But many times what we find is that students do not really look at their dashboards, and they actually disengage with them. So we want to know basically in what ways are students engaged with their dashboards, and basically in the whole learning process as they interact online. And also we found that there is some work that links engagement with metacognitive regulation, because when you monitor and when you monitor your own learning progress, when you plan and evaluate their learning, which is basically metacognitive regulation, or MR for short, you actually, that can possibly that engagement with what you're doing can potentially help you practice that metacognitive regulation. So we want to establish the possible link, and also there's also a call to enhance the design of learner dashboards to be more pedagogically based, and to scaffold and support the learning processes. Next. So going to what is part of the title, multimodal learning analytics. I know this group is multimodals or multimodality. So I think that's where actually Victor has come in with some of his inputs from the multimodal semiotics perspective. So many of you might be familiar. So multimodal semiotics is actually about meaning making. Learning is meaning making, and you integrate social practice with semiotic practice. So your language and so on. And so it is important to have these tools to help you recognize what is learning. So that's more from the, I would say, design and learning perspective. Then there's another stream of work that is from the learning analytics, or a bit more data-driven perspective. And so how they relate to each other, I would say, is they're focusing on the process of meaning-making. Not so much the outcomes of results or whatever, but it's the process. Okay, so in multimodal learning analytics, it comes from learning analytics, this field, and some people call MMLA the next generation of learning analytics. So you can see from the multiple, right? It's not just unimodal or one modality, but they want to make use of multiple data modalities. And this is actually at different levels. So it can be at the activity level, at the signal level, and others. And the idea in these, using a multimodal approach, is that time is very important. So the time that you capture, because you capture the whole time span and the process. So this actually helps to more reliably calibrate learning processes and outcomes. And so putting in multiple data streams actually helps to, it has been shown to increase or predict better. Obviously, you enhance your predictions. Yeah. So that's why we want to use this multimodal linked analytics approach, or MLA approach, to capture engagement. So looking at engagement itself, this is the aims of the project. Basically to use this MLA approach to better understand learner dashboard engagements in ecological context. So not only in experimental settings, but in the local classroom settings. And then, as I mentioned earlier, to look at how engagement relates to MR, and also to design dashboards with principles and to test different conditions of dashboard designs. And lastly, to contribute to the larger research policy practice integration. Going on the next slide, I briefly talked about engagement. And engagement in the literature, there's so many definitions, and that's part of the they call it the jingle jangle. There's so many definitions and mishmash of different definitions. We're using this one actually by our colleagues here in NIE. This is Wong and Liam. Yeah, so it's Arif and Ziyang. So they have actually reviewed the literature on engagement, and this is how they have defined it, and which we are using. And in general, there's three dimensions of engagement, but we are focusing on the affective and behavioral aspect of engagement. And these are the definitions we'll be focusing on. Basically, affective is about feeling the emotions, feeling activated. And behavioral engagement is about effort, exerting effort. Yeah, next slide. For the RQs, we are looking at RQ1A, which is basically how do we identify these engagement levels when they are using the learner dashboards or the whole learning process, and then what forms of dashboard engagement relate to students' MR. And the study is a large-scale study, so we are now actually phase 1. So next slide. There's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So phase 1 is basically RQ1. And this is where we are trying to use this MLA approach to actually develop this measure of engagement. Yeah. So we have actually collected video data as well as, next slide, video data. So what we're focusing on is data that is relatively scalable. It's something that most students would have, especially when we're looking at the secondary school context. So they would have, right now they all have the PLDs, right? So and the PLDs are equipped with a video cam, webcam. So it's basically the webcam on their upper body. So that's the video from webcam. And then as they type, there's digital traces on the learning system itself. And what we hope to do was actually to draw out these different features to actually model dashboard engagement. I'll not go through the details. Quick, next slide, please. In view of time, and so because we want to go on to some of the findings that we have found. So this is our plan that we managed to carry out more or less. We basically collected these two forms of data from, as I mentioned, from video and digital traces. And we also did a learner survey. So we had, one is the engagement surveys as students engage in the learning scenario, which you'll see in the next slide. And then we also had interviews of selected students, and we had a pre and post activity survey. Next slide. Just to mention, this is phase 2. What we plan to do is to actually evaluate, design different dashboards, basically three conditions of the dashboards to actually understand how different dashboard designs can influence students' engagement behavior. Next slide. So our system itself, the learning system, is something that my team and I have developed in the past. So for phase 1, we're using this system called WeRead. I believe we have shared about WeRead in other webinars and talks. So what we have done, basically this is a bit like perusal, if you heard of perusal. Basically it is the teacher puts in an article, a multimodal article, basically has pictures, can also have videos. And then you click on it and you can highlight. And then when you highlight, you always have to select 2 tags. Yeah, and the tags are related to something that the teacher wants the students to learn. So what we have done as a default, what the lesson usually requires, because it's related to critical reading, reading tags that are from Paul Elder's Wheel of Critical Reasoning. So that is critical lenses, so such as message, purpose, audience. And then the second tag is related to how they converse. So students will annotate with the two tags, and then they can reply to each other too. The second part of reread is this dynamic formative learning analytics dashboard that is used for feedback. So the two tags, as highlighted earlier, are now displayed in this radar chart as well as a bar chart. So what you can see here is the number of times the student has used this tag. In this case, message is used about 6 times for this student. Okay, so this learner dashboard serves as a visible feedback of the learners in terms of how they have used their tags. And we also have this reflect and set goals button, as you can see there, that actually gets students can click on it if they want to, and then there's some questions for them to reflect about what they see here in this information. So this is what we provide to the students. And then how we use this tool is according to active learning scaffolds in the next slide. So we designed 2 learning scenarios that are very similar to real life. One in English and one in science, and they follow the active learning scaffold. So it's about activate learning. So in this case, they watch the video, and then they are asked to basically provide annotations and then reply to other students, which are, in this case, it was simulated data. So there are already 2 posts inside there, and as classmates, and then they were to reply to them. And then for monitor and provide feedback, they were to look at their own dashboard. And then they were asked to do anything else they could do. And then lastly, they would demonstrate their learning through answering a quiz. Next slide. So this is implemented as seen in English and Science. And so as mentioned, they had video, an article, and then the 2 pre-posted annotations, and then with a quiz. Okay, so this is the learning setup. And then how did we collect the data? So this required some work. So we engaged a vendor to develop this data acquisition layer, okay, for the multimodal layer learning analytics. So it's a browser-based tool called Study UX Lite. Basically, it's part of the whole process. Students will sort of log in here, and then they select a topic, and basically this system will get the students to share their video with this tool and make sure it's being shared, and so they'll be recorded, and then it'll provide us with both the video data as well as the logs of the timings of the capture. And so we did this for our phase 1, this is in an experimental setting, lab setting, and we've managed to, we targeted 50 students, so we did hit that target just above by just 51, but we also lost some data in the process, but anyway, and we interviewed 15. So this is our phase 1 data collection, and so as I mentioned, we are focusing a lot on the survey and video for this session. So next up, Christine will share more based on the survey modality.
Yes. Okay. So now going on to how we did the survey part, I'll just recap that Elizabeth mentioned that we designed it according to the active learning principles, and we built this into different junctures of the task. So students first do a pre-survey, and then they set up the system, like the base recording and all, in the data ingestion system. Then for the task itself, they first watch a video, and then we get them to complete an engagement survey at juncture 1, and we call this juncture 1. And then they go on to post their annotations and reply to other annotations on the system. And after that, we get them to do the engagement survey again at juncture 2. So this will be juncture 2. And then we go on to the third part where they view the dashboard, and they can do any other actions such as posting more annotations. And then we get them to fill in the engagement survey again at juncture 3. So we focus on these 3 junctures. For the engagement survey itself, we use 2 measures to get their survey responses. One was for emotional engagement, where we had 4 items, and these are the 4 items, basically whether they're attentive, interested, determined, enthusiastic during the activity or that juncture itself. And then moving on to behavioral engagement, we had 3 items, which was about them putting in effort, giving their full attention, and concentrating hard. So these 2 constructs make up our engagement survey measure. And for the analysis, we combine, because we have 2 learning scenarios, we combine the both of them, basically summing up the responses to look at students' emotional and behavioral engagement. And then we tried to categorize them into high and low engagement for emotional and behavioral, basically using the midpoint of the scale. So those who were rated themselves 1 and 2 would be low engagement, and those who are 3 and 4 would be high engagement. And that is how we categorize the students. So first, looking at the data at the different junctures, we see that a high percentage of the students rated themselves as being highly emotionally engaged compared to those who are low emotionally engaged. And this is the same for behavioral engagement as well, where a high percentage rated themselves as being highly engaged compared to those who are low behaviorally engaged. And we also noticed that the engagement tends to get a little lower as they go through the different junctures. For example, there are a higher percentage of students rating themselves as lower in emotional and behavioral engagement when they got to juncture 3. And that was something that we thought was interesting. And then for the rest of the analysis, instead of breaking down the data into the different junctures, we focus the categorization on like the combined engagement for the whole activity for junctures 1, 2, and 3 to help us simplify the analysis and to be able to interpret it better. So so this gives us a view of the different junctures, and then we move on to the combined one. So now looking at our first RQ, what forms of engagement do students demonstrate when they use the learner dashboard? So this is based on the 3 junctures combined, and again we see that most of the students were highly engaged, with 71% of them rating themselves as being highly emotionally engaged, and 84% rating themselves as being highly behaviorally engaged. So we see quite a large proportion of students are highly engaged. And we also asked, we interviewed 15 students in total to understand their participation and their impressions of the system and the dashboard that they used. And this was a summary of the findings from the interview data. So for the high emotional engagement students, we saw that the responses were generally positive. Generally, they found the content and the subject to be interesting. The annotation process was enjoyable to them. We found the text helpful, and we also thought it was easy to understand the dashboard. And we even had one student who found it so interesting that they wanted to find out even more about dashboards in general. In contrast, when we look at some of the responses from the low emotional engagement students, some students mentioned that they didn't find the videos interesting. And some of them were a bit confused about the annotation process. They weren't sure what exactly to do. Some also found that the surveys were a bit repetitive because they had to do the same survey like 3 times for one learning scenario and then again for the second one. So some of them found that repetitive. And they might also find the dashboard and goal setting boring. Some also requested for more instructions because maybe they were not sure what to do. And then looking at the behavioral engagement, the high behavioral engagement students also expressed how it was useful for them to improve their understanding and possibly even help them in their exams. Some students also felt that the process of creating the annotation, selecting the text, made them think harder. And some of them talked about putting in more effort into the task. And one student even challenged themselves by choosing the metacognitive tasks that they thought were actually harder for them. And then when looking at the low behavioral engagement students, generally they express putting in minimal effort. They just followed the instructions and did what they were asked to do, and just tried to meet whatever was required of them. And yeah, so that was for RQ1A. Moving on to the second RQ, which was related to metacognitive regulation. We used these two scales to measure their metacognitive regulation at the pre and post activity. So before they started doing everything, and at the end, once they were done with everything. So we focused on dashboard MR, which is more about how they used feedback or data, and then also a more general MR. We did a correlation analysis with behavioral and emotional engagement as boredom, which is another measure that we had, which is just one item called boredom. And then for the dashboard MR, we looked at pre and post to see if there were any changes. And for the general MR, we were mostly just looking at post activity. So from our results, we see that there was no significant correlation between engagement and pre-dashboard MR. So it was not connected at before the activity, but at post-activity, we see that behavioral engagement has a strong correlation with both dashboard MR and general MR. And then looking at the interview data related to this, we were able to identify codes related to planning, monitoring, and evaluating, which are constructs under metacognitive regulation. And then for planning, students talked about how knowing the goal beforehand allowed them to help them in their time management. Some of them referred to their prior knowledge to complete the task. They talked about thinking about which is the best tag or most suitable tag that they could use. They planned based on the instructions given to them for the task. And there were also instances of lack of planning where some just skipped the dashboard activity or didn't really engage with the goal setting. So they didn't do much of their planning. And then moving on to monitoring, we had a student talking about how viewing other students' annotations give them a bird's eye view of what's happening perhaps in the class and the discussion. And we had students who also talked about using the dashboard to check for clarity, make amendments in whatever they've posted, check their progress, or even check for weaknesses such as things they have not done yet. And then lastly, for evaluating, one student talked about how they reflected about how they felt that whatever they had posted, the way that they thought and analyzed kind of reflected on them as a person. And, they actually spent time evaluating what they had posted. And talking about the dashboard, some of them talked about how they reflected on their work based on the dashboard. They acknowledged their progress or the status, and they also found it useful to know how to improve. So now looking back at the findings from RQ1A, where we had majority of the students were emotionally and behaviorally engaged in this learning analytics system. And we also noticed that there were a higher percentage of students who reported being highly behavioral engaged, with about 84%, and then compared to those who were highly emotionally engaged, with about 71%. And this could possibly be due to there being different engagement profiles. So in the literature, there are some profiles that have been identified, such as being fully engaged, where students are highly engaged in both emotional and behavioral engagement. We also have compliant learners, where, as with some of the students in this case, they were behaviorally engaged, even if they were not emotionally engaged, they still participated and did the task. And then you can also have low engagement students. And for example, Corner and Pope found that both full engagement and to a smaller extent compliant engagement has been associated with better academic performance and well-being. So it's not entirely a bad thing that some of these students are behaviorally engaged, even if not emotionally. So there's still some positive there. And possibly examining these different profiles may give us more insight into learning engagement and how different profiles may be more adaptive. Another finding was that the engagement was slightly lower for juncture 3, where they did the dashboard. And we think one possibility could be because students are very familiar with viewing and posting or writing their responses, but they may not have as much experience or skill with engaging with the feedback, with dashboards, and this could possibly have contributed to the lower engagement. Yeah. And then for RQ1B, we saw a positive correlation between behavioral engagement and the post-activity MR. So as students became more engaged in their learning behaviors, they also regulate their learning. And this link may be possibly stronger or more direct for behavioral engagement than emotional engagement, because we didn't see the same correlation for emotional engagement. And it could be that the behaviors such as viewing the dashboard, spending time reflecting, modifying your behavior, all of these require your behavioral effort. So that could be why there may be a more direct link. There could also be a possibly bi-directional relationship between behavioral engagement and MR, where basically providing students metacognitive feedback is increased with is associated with increasing their learning engagement. So this could have also contributed to the higher of behavioral engagement. Yeah. We also see a positive correlation between emotional and behavioral engagement, and this is in line with the conceptualization of learning engagement as a multi-dimensional construct. So it's not just one thing, but related sub-constructs such as emotional, behavioral, and also cognitive engagement. And then we also saw that boredom was not significantly related to emotional and behavioral engagement. And this is in line with the conceptualization of engagement and disengagement as distinct processes. So examining them separately may give us more insight into these processes. I'll now hand over to Alwyn.
Yep. Thank you, Christine. And also thank you, Elizabeth, for starting the presentation. So now we are on to the next part of this multimodal project, essentially to look at a video modality. So this video modality, in essence, is actually encapsulating quite a few other smaller modalities if you want to break it down, because the video does have different elements such as the audio parts of stuff, like whether people is actually talking towards a video, what can you detect from a visual part of the video. So for this particular project and in this mode itself, we are actually only just looking at the facial expressions of students to identify the student emotional and behavioral engagement. And as mentioned previously, we are only looking at the emotional and the behavioral engagements. Next slide. So this diagram here is to encapsulate the data collection pipeline that we are looking across all the tasks that we are doing here for every single student. So a single student will be sitting in front of a laptop with a webcam looking at their face, predominantly cut off at around the neck area, so that we are only focusing only on what the student is expressing on their faces. Then all of them have unique IDs so that we know what they did and which data belongs to which student. So the second computer sign, you'll see that the camera is switched on, whereby we're then trying to understand task 1, then it goes into J1, what we call juncture 1 survey, task 2, juncture 2, task 3, juncture 3. So there are different junctures and tasks, reason being I'll actually explain in the next slide thereafter. But after they have completed all these tasks, we will then download the video, and then this video will then be what we call split into different smaller video segments with based on the timing log file, that means the time of completion. Next slide. And so before I go into how we do the processing, feature extraction, analysis, I'd like to point out what we are actually trying to measure in this video itself is the use of AUs, action units. So if you're familiar with this thing called the FACS, Facial Action Coding System, so actually it's a set of facial muscle movements. It was actually originally created by Carl Herman with 23 facial motions. Then it was popularized with Paul Ekman's, and also it is actually first published quite long ago, nearly 50 years ago. And it's actually now been updated in 2002, so still about 2 decades ago. So the 3 main reasons why we actually use these action units, I also quote quite a bit from, there's an eye motions kind of website. If you take a look at it, you'll see what I'm quoting here is actually aligned with what they are saying. First of which is we want it to be a non-intrusive emotion measurement method. So the capture of these expressions in real time, right, actually does not need the students or participants to report their feelings, either through verbal means or either by writing or any other kinds of mechanisms. There are other methods whereby you use physiological sensors. You might be using other kinds of like online digital measures. So this is actually one way whereby using the videos itself, the action units themselves actually will tell us or maybe give us some indications of what a student is feeling and expressing. So using action units, we are also able to obtain high temporal precision. So when we do all this kind of facial codings, in the past it's through manual coding. And therefore, when we do this manual coding, it is still high temporal precision in trying to analyze the different kind of micro expressions and the different changes in the face. And of course, what we want to look for is objective and quantifiable data. So point 3 actually is telling us that we should actually look for something that's suitable for a mixed methods approach, as they are oftentimes complementary to each other. So in contrast to a fully qualitative method or fully quantitative method, the action units that we're using also with our analysis in this project itself is actually rather mixed methods. And also, other than being able to do rigorous statistical analysis, we'll also be able to qualify the different kinds of expressions in a very qualitative manner. Next slide. So just to give an example of what a AU actually really means in this context, don't mind the creepy face. It's the nicest example I can find. But this is the best kind of example for action units because the rest will be sadness, disgust, contempt, and stuff. So the nicest one is actually this. So happiness and joy is actually normally represented by two things. One, which is the brow. The other is the lips, as you can see. There are many technical terms here that they call it, like you can see description as cheek raiser. So you raise your cheek, you have a lip corner puller, and then they have a lip tightener. All these kind of terms are really come into play when you look at all the AUs. Actually, it's in a very large book, the FACS manual. I believe you need to pay for the full manual, but you can still look at it as a very short abstract or maybe some, I mean, it is a very common knowledge thing. It's just that if you really want to code everything very detailedly, then you need to really get the manual for that. So there are jobs that are actually called FACS coders too. So that is, I think, yeah. So this is just an example of how AUs can actually help to express emotions. Happiness and joy is actually what we consider a universal emotion. So it's something that is very basic in that sense, universal. There are different kinds of emotions that we are looking into, but for this particular project itself, we're actually looking at emotional engagement and what they're expressing. So we cannot really detail or identify, like say, oh, happiness plus something is equivalent to engagement, because that is a very difficult statement to make in the very first place. So what we're actually looking at is the different combinations or types of action units that actually construe into a single type of engagement, whether it's emotional or whether it's a behavioral engagement, and also whether it's high or low. So let me explain a little bit more about that in the next slides. So the data that we're working with is actually front-facing videos. I call it front-facing portrait videos because we are looking at portraits of students, something like passport photos. It's 50 students and up to 6 videos from each student. So if you recall, we actually look at 3 junctures from every students, but then because we're doing it in 2 different kinds of subjects, so we do have up to 6 videos from each student, and therefore we have 300 videos, or I would say up to 300 videos from this particular phase itself. Unfortunately, I think if you look at the last slide, we only have 290 due to data attrition. So although it might not seem like a lot, like somebody saying like, oh, you only have 300 videos, but I think each video itself does have a duration that is not trivial itself. And why is it like this is because from the third point, you can see that the average video length is about 30 to 40 minutes. And then there's different tasks in there, video watching, annotation, commenting, and also dashboard visualization, how students look at all the dashboards, and also them writing the reflections itself. So all these actually form a very long video, which then we need to break it down because we were trying to align it with the different tasks and also trying to understand when do students feel a certain emotion at different parts of the task itself. So I think the point 4 on how the data is partitioned is more machine learning aspect, whereby you have to train the data. So we have 33 data set to train it. We are testing the data. And then we predict the data sets that have incomplete survey results from what Christine has shared. So that's how we actually try to do the prediction. And then for phase 2, moving forward, we actually use all the data sets we did this phase itself for training purposes. So that's how we try to scale up. The total data points per video is actually quite a lot, as mentioned. If you do the calculations, it's about 918,000 points per video. So that's nearly 1 million. So if you have 300 videos, then you have 300 million points. So this is actually really what we call large data in a sense. Next slide. So once you have the video, what we do is that we actually try to do feature extraction. We try to analyze and focus on the use of combined junctures. So if you recall, we have junction 1, 2, 3, but what we are doing is to take an average across all the different junctures itself, because we found that was the most accurate based on several models we have. And the features that we're trying to identify from the data sets were used from this open source library that's using a Python code. So we are only able to identify up to 17 action units from the larger FACS system, which is, I think, about 65 to 79 action units in that sense. So you realize there's some limitations when we try to automate this process, because the computer itself is also limited to a certain list or number of action units. Of course, there are more competent systems out there, but of course, they will then be more proprietary. They need more money, they need more resources. So just to highlight a bit some of the AUs that we are actually using in this project, the last 3 points, which you can see, AU 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9. These are actually all brow, eyes, and nose related. We have chin and lips related. So you can see there's a little bit of difference and segregation there, which is the upper face and the lower face. You'll see why that is in the results later. There's also, of course, the other part of it, which is jaw and also blinking itself. Next slide. So this lady here is actually how we actually do the boxing and also try to understand where all the what we call landmark facial features are. We call them muscles and facial muscles. The box is actually what we call the head pose, HEAD pose itself. And then you have lasers coming out. That is actually your eye gaze. Next slide. So of course, what we will try to do at the very start, because this is a very large project, but we also are exploring to the unknown kind of thing. So what we do is to visualize the results using a box and whiskers. So the top left diagram is actually what we call a high emotion, high behavior student. This is actually one of the students, but most of them exhibit roughly the same kind of action units. How to read this graph is the x-axis is actually the number of action units from left to right. I think at this point, it does not really matter because there are too many. But what is more important to be seen here is that there are different patterns in which all these AUs actually transpire and emerge from the project itself. For example, top left, you can see that there's quite a mix of different AUs across the whole spectrum of like scores on the y-axis from 0 to 2, sometimes to 1. Whereas if you see the low emotion and low behavior student, there's actually I mean, probably it's difficult to eyeball at this point, but there is actually a kind of imaginary line in the middle that you can draw across. In machine learning, sometimes you do what I call PCA, principal component analysis. You try to draw a line through and try to understand, is there like a clear-cut yes or no, present or not present kind of answer to this kind of data. Next slide. And so from there, you can see more box and whiskers here, but this is actually what we actually trying to say here is that the feature importance is very difficult to define. So based on 50 students and the 300 videos, we found that AU 1, 2, 7, 15, 35 are significant. We actually reported this during an LAK, which is a Learning Analytics Conference next year. We found that actually many brow, lips related are actually quite important features that we need to pay attention to. So this is just evidencing what we found. Next slide. And then we are actually doing this processing with a confidence interval between 0.88 to 0.98. So this is rather reasonable in our approach. But we also need to answer the research questions. So as similar to what Christine has mentioned previously for the survey modality, using the MLA approach, what forms of engagement do students demonstrate? So at this point in time, we can reliably identify the AUs behind 3 of the 4 forms of engagement. the 4 forms of engagement are the different combinations of high emotion, high behavior, then low, low. So high, 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 low, low, high, and low, low. These are the 4 forms of engagement we are envisioning that occurs in students. We treat them as mutually exclusive. That means you cannot be high, high and high, low at the same time, which is a bit weird. So for our case, we are able to identify the AUs behind 3 of the 4. The only one that you might have noticed, which is high emotion and low behavior, is actually what we call a less frequent occurrence. So we actually do need more data from phases 2 and 3 to actually certify, like, is this really an anomaly, or is this really something that we are picking up now through this study itself? So question 1B also asks what forms of dashboard engagement are related. So if you remember the previous modality from the surveys itself, behavioral engagement after activity is associated with metacognitive regulation, MR. So as the students become more engaged, you also regulate their thinking. And therefore, the possible impact we're looking at here is that it is actually possible to use identification of mentioned AUs to predict students' engagement level. And therefore, you will be able to then align it with the MR itself. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to fly through some of this. It's actually more visual at this point. But this is one way in which we try to categorize different engagement combinations. I call it the onion. That means you go from the small parts. So the core action units that we found to be important for all these engagement identifications is 1, 4, and 7. Actually, they are also brow and eyelid related, and then it becomes bigger. So the more AUs that you involve, the more complex and different kinds of indicators you will then need to bring into it. And therefore, I think that's why machine learning is probably essential for this process itself. Next slide. And of course, for reliable prediction, because we have very unbalanced data, as you can see on the left, because this project is actually done locally, so we have students who are mostly or predominantly very engaged, and therefore we have very high engaged students or being self-reported, and very low number of students who are actually disengaged or not engaged at all. So I think this is a slide to explain that we do need to balance the data. We use what we call SMOTE, smooth oversampling technique, to ensure that at least we synthesize some data to make sure they oversample and then be able to get a better result. Next slide. And this is the result. Just to point out the top, the second column, accuracy scores, that is the one that we're looking at. If you're applying SMOTE to your results or to your data, it does affect your accuracy. As you can see, the one on top is always higher than the one below, considering the 4 different cases that you're looking at. Next slide. And ongoing and subsequent work considerations, we have considered using a multi-output logistic regression so as to encapsulate all given data sources from a single model. So we are trying to do as a multi-output logistic regression model. All the scores are actually quite good at this point, just that the accuracy suffers a bit. So we are actually working to find out why is this so. And then also, we found that subject domain does not significantly affect the engagement result at this point. So moving forward, it's likely that we can also not really need to differentiate the task by subjects during analysis, but we'll still keep this differentiator at this point. Next slide. Yeah, so at this stage, you can see the top and the bottom results on the right. Actually, the girl is showing what we call a brow-related movement. Is a bit difficult from images because these are videos that move in sequences. But then the top one is showing the brow, the bottom one is showing the lip. So we have the following observations is that brow and lip related action units are actually very important indicators for engagement. Blinking, number 2, the blinking point is that it used to be related with what we call cognitive processes and attentional engagement, but it's not really a significant factor at this point for this assigned task. Next slide. And then the other 3 observations we got was that the proportion of high emotional, low behavioral, so just now what you saw, is actually just 2 out of 50 participants. So this is a significantly smaller I would say population of this particular class. So we will need to then try to see if this is an anomaly or whether there's a certain phenomenon that's emerging from this study. And also subject differentiated tasks produce similar trends. I think we have talked about that. So the last point is that this performance is actually suitable, and also we assess to be sufficient for the scaling phases of the larger project itself. Yeah. So I think this is the last slide. So Elizabeth, you want to wrap up? Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm trying to put things together. So I mean, these are some of the preliminary contributions. And so responding to, I think, Charmaine's question, it was actually quite challenging to design and collect and analyze this multimodal data. Actually, the dashboard, students, when they were using the whole learning system on Reread, the dashboard time was not very, some students would really zip past the dashboard, but some would take more time. So it really would depend on whether I would say there's no one pattern that we saw in terms of the dashboard use, but even though we told them to look at it to monitor your data. So in fact, the whole video sequence, we had to use all the data from the video, not only the dashboard section, but actually the whole video section to actually analyze it for engagement. And so you can see here, we've also analyzed it only at the unimodal level, so separately at each data stream. And we have not combined it. So that's will be the next part of our analysis to actually perform this data fusion for this multimodal data analysis. And we are preparing for phase 2 to look at the actual dashboard design. So basically the different conditions in the dashboard. So putting it together for engagement, basically we are trying to validate our engagement model from this video trace and survey data. And this requires quite a lot of effort. And then we did also triangulate it with interview data of selected students. So what we see in this phase 1 is that most students, because it's a lab setting, you can understand students come into a lab, it's one-to-one, and it could be NIE, could be in your school. So we had different settings. We had even out of school. So basically, it's one-to-one with the researcher. So they are, in front of the screens. So you can see most of them will be engaged, but actually we saw students who are less engaged. Yeah, but in general, most students report themselves being emotionally and behaviorally engaged, with more reporting higher in terms of behavioral engagement as compared to emotional engagement. Which sort of makes sense, right? Because the actions or the fate or your expression looks more you're engaged, but actually you may not feel that in terms of interest in this topic. Yeah. So this suggests that some students may be highly engaged behaviorally, even if not highly engaged emotionally. So that's what we found in phase 1. And we also found related to MR, metacognitive regulation. I think there's a question earlier. We were trying to look, this is the exploratory part. So we're going to, using the surveys, see how it's linked. It's sort of higher engagement does not always link to higher metacognitive regulation. In fact, what we found was actually it is behavioral engagement was more linked to metacognitive regulation, suggesting that because of behavioral engagement's actionable nature, that, like for example, in planning, that could be the relation, whereas the relationship with emotional engagement is not so straightforward. So going forward, so we definitely have a lot more analysis to do, and we also want to continue our phase 2 to design the dashboard conditions to see the different effects of different dashboard designs on learners' engagement. Yeah, so thank you for your questions. I think I've addressed all, but I guess thank you for your participation also.